This lecture is part of the History 363 Modern Africa class at Flagler College. We're talking today about African identity and African protest during the time of advanced colonialism, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, previous to the outbreak of the Second World War. This is also the part of the class where students are assigned to read a longer primary source, a novel by the Malian novelist Amadou Hampâté Bâ, concerning, well, the book itself is called The Fortunes of Wangrin. This book is fictional, though it is based certainly on the experience that many people had in Africa during the colonial era. It focuses specifically on the life and career of a colonial middleman, somebody who, the main character Wangrin, who spoke both Wolof, I believe it's Wolof, as takes place in Senegal, Wolof and French, and thus served as a translator and intermediary between the colonial governors and the chiefs, the indirect rule chiefs. And we can see throughout the book there are many instances where he is able to take advantage of both of the parties for which he is the intermediary. He's really quite creative in what he does, and thus we have this very interesting story of a successful career of a colonial middleman. Now, the requirement for this book is to write a primary source exploration, and I have provided some suggestions for that in the syllabus itself. There's a whole sheet about how to write a primary source exploration. But a couple of pointers. One of the things that you need to do in this case, since this is an unprompted paper, is to choose a topic. Now, for this book, one of the, there are just a couple of ideas. One is to simply talk about the role of the colonial middleman, to explore the way that role functioned in the colonial system, to talk about the issue of communication between the European colonial officials and their African subjects. You could talk certainly about some of the social systems of social organization under colonialism. Wangrin is a manipulator of people, and this involves at times, manipulating marriages or other social relationships. And so, to discuss to explore the ways in which colonialism affected the social systems in Africa would be a perfectly acceptable topic. To discuss the way that colonialism impacted the culture of Africa might be another one. The sort of cultural sensibilities, the way that Africans conceived, something we might call folklore, the way that Africans conceived of their world. How does that change under colonialism, and how do figures like these middlemen and the indirect rule chiefs influence that, or become subject to the transformation of culture? And so those are just some kind of broad ideas. So it's imperative that you choose a topic and explore that, and use the book as evidence to back up your assertions about that. This paper needs a thesis. It needs to be to some extent an original paper, your own thoughts, your own research on this. And so this is not a book review, as we have written with the Boahen and the Hochschild books. This is a primary source exploration. If you have questions about this, please feel free to ask them on the syllabus. Sorry, not on the syllabus, but on the discussion boards. I'd be happy to answer questions received via email as well. Okay, so our discussion today revolves around the changing notions of African identity and the rise of African protest and other forms of African pushback against the colonial system in the 1920s and 1930s. And this brings us to a subject that we have discussed very marginally already, but which we need to discuss in more detail, which is the notion of tribe. Now, I talked at the very beginning of the course, the opening lectures of the course, about the problems of the term tribe as it relates to Africa, and I think in the last lecture talked about the rise of something called tribalism. And this was a tremendously important cultural force, but it's a complex one. Tribe, though there were precursors to the tribes that were identified as for purposes of social organization by the colonial powers, the tribal identities that became important to many peoples in Africa really only developed to the scale that came to characterize 20th century Africa during the colonial period. And so, just a couple of examples. There were, for instance, Fulani peoples, or Zulu peoples, or Gonda people, or Hutu and Tutsi, or Wolof, or Gikuyu, or Maasai, or, we could keep going with this. There were people who identified under those labels previous to the late 19th century with the rise of colonialism. But for the most part, those labels were rather fluid. They changed with the passage of generations, with the rise and fall of political entities, whether on a large scale like the major kingdoms of the Middle Ages in West Africa, or in the early 19th century, the Sokoto Caliphate, or on a small scale, with just small kind of extended kinship groups establishing hegemony over a very, very small region. Micro-states or non-hegemonic states, or, there are lots of different forms of political organization in Africa. And these sorts of identities, what we might call ethnic or tribal identities, were similarly fluid and changed rapidly over the course of the centuries. These were not hard and fast things that were permanent in Africa. Even in the course of one's lifetime, depending on the vicissitudes of that particular lifetime, one might change one's tribal identity perhaps 2 or 3 times. A woman gets married and leaves the group that she belonged to join her husband's group, or vice versa, depending on whether this is a patrilineal or matrilineal society. The husband could leave his family and go and join his wife's group. Maybe there's a war, and the villages who lose the war end up being incorporated into the victorious group and thus become part of a new ethnic identity. Maybe people move and become associated with other people. There are lots of reasons why these identities were fluid. Had to do with social relationships, had to do with trade, had to do with warfare, had to do with migration. There were lots and lots of reasons why identities shifted over time. Well, Europeans, once they went in and created the colonial system in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Africa, were, as we talked about last time, looking for people to co-opt, to become part of their system. And they tended to do so with the idea that Africa was a tribal place, that the primary identities people had were tribal. And without understanding the nuances and the fluidity of these tribes, Europeans identified specific people by tribe, and then as they created these indirect rule chiefdoms, they hardened that tribal identity. So that's from the European perspective. They needed some way of making sense of what they encountered in Africa, and some way of figuring out how to organize the place. And so they identified these people as members of tribes, and considered that those tribal conditions to be permanent and timeless, rather than fluid and ever-changing. Now, there are reasons, many reasons actually, why Africans under the colonial system decided to embrace these tribal identities. First of all, if the Europeans were, you know, doling out resources and favors and political power and other things on the basis of these tribal organizations, then it made perfect sense for these African peoples to say, yes, I'm a Zulu, or yes, I'm a Xhosa, or yes, I'm a Maasai, or whatever it was. According to the European understanding, certain tribes were good at certain things and other tribes were good at other things. Certain tribes were warlike and thus should be recruited as soldiers. Other tribes were more agricultural. Others were more engaged in trade. And so depending on the identification, people would adopt those identities and buy into the idea that these were definitive for them. Because that meant, I mean, if somebody identified as coming from a particular tribe, that could grant them privilege. Those who identified or most readily embraced the notion of tribe, of course, were the chiefs, because being the chief of a particular tribe made them automatic partners with the colonial powers, because that was the way that the British and French and Portuguese and others interacted with the Africans politically and socially. And so there was a utility to this. Over time, and in a complex way, it's in a way that varied from place to place and over time, even the intellectuals and the other kind of malcontents within these African groups began to embrace the tribal identifications. They did this because they thought that, especially the intellectuals who were trying to foment for rebellion against the colonial system, who were the leading proponents of nationalism or other forms of protest, they saw the tribal identities as the major vehicle that they could use to organize people on a mass scale. If they could somehow convince all of the members of a particular tribe that they were aggrieved, that their claims were legitimately better than what they were currently enjoying, they would do so, and they did it on the basis of tribe. And so even the intellectuals get behind this, and tribe becomes a very important part of many of the protest movements that we'll be discussing a bit further in this lecture. So tribalism is, again, a tremendously complex thing, partly created by Europeans, partly there already, partly embraced by those who had a stake in the power structures of colonialism, partly embraced by those who didn't have a stake and who were protesting against it. Though all of these embracings and rejections happened in different ways and for different reasons. A few examples of these trends: the Fulani people, who were kind of the basis of the Sokoto Caliphate at the beginning of the 19th century. If you remember, Uthman Danfodio was from the Fulani. That was a relatively new distinction, really kind of grew up just before the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate. These were pastoralists, and so pastoral ethnic identities tend to be more fluid than agriculturalists because they move around more and interact with more peoples. Well, once the British established rule over northern Nigeria and the kind of the Sahelian region, they identified chiefs among them, and the Fulani really began to take on a kind of permanent identity in that case. And the same thing happened to some extent with the Zulu. The Zulu really were the creation of Shaka. There were people who called themselves Zulu before that, but as we saw in an earlier lecture, with the military kind of imperial tendencies, the conquests of Shaka Zulu, more and more people joined the ranks of the Zulu, and this became and the whole identity of Zulu came to be bound up with militarism and kind of a jingoistic pride, and so that was part of the creation of the Zulu. But then the Europeans contributed to this once they identified the Zulu as, the residents of Zululand, and began to treat them as if they were a timeless ethnic identity. The Gonda in Uganda, another instance for this. Of course, the Gonda had been a kind of ethnic basis of the Kingdom of Buganda previous to this time, and they were, constantly in a rivalry with a kingdom just to their northwest, Bunyoro. But the Gonda ethnic identity and the Nyoro ethnic identity in Uganda were, again, really quite fluid things. It's thought that the Gonda probably came from the Nyoro, that this was a political break that happened at some point in the late 17th or early 18th century. And so these identifications were ever evolving and really quite recent. The Gonda took on a permanence really with the British, establishing colonial hegemony over Uganda, because the Gonda themselves, especially the Kabaka, their king, were favored colonial officials. They were the kind of privileged indirect rule chiefs in Uganda, and so for that reason, that identity crystallized. But so did the identity of the Nyoro, really for the exact opposite reason. The Nyoro began to crystallize in their identity because they were not privileged, and they saw this as a way to protest, a way to strike out against their overlords, those who had control over them, including the Gonda. There's nothing more effective at crystallizing an identity than identifying an enemy, and that certainly was the case for the Nyoro and the Gonda. And the same went, tragically, for the Hutu and the Tutsi. And we talked about these earlier in the term, but Hutu pretty much was just a word for agriculturalist in the Great Lakes region. Tutsi was the word for pastoralist. These identities were incredibly fluid. I mean, those words did exist, but they did not mean kind of these hardened, timeless ethnic identities, really until the Belgians took over Rwanda and Burundi after the First World War, after this was taken away from Germany, and Belgian rule was extended from the Congo into that part of Africa. And the Belgians, needing to make some sense of the lay of the land, identified those who could be their partners as these Tutsi, because they were the minority, but they also used the basis of appearance, and so they noticed that the Tutsi, the pastoralists, tended to be slightly taller than the Hutu, though that was a generalization. And so in many cases, and also that they had, in some cases, lighter skin. They even were so trite as to identify the Tutsi as those who had narrower noses. And so in creating these identifications, at times the Belgian colonial officials would go in with measuring sticks and identify those who were taller and lighter skinned and had thinner noses as Tutsi, and granted them privileges and took them on as their indirect rule chiefs and interlocutors, and identified the majority of people as Hutu. And by privileging the Tutsi over the Hutu, they created a great deal of animosity, such that both Tutsi and Hutu began to embrace these identities because it gave them something to. It created an enemy in that case. The Tutsi. Sorry, I'm pronouncing these wrong. The Tutsi in the case of the Hutu, and the Hutu in the case of the Tutsi, and that will. We'll continue to take up this topic in later lectures, but that leads, of course, to the very tragic events in the second half of the 20th century, culminating in the Rwandan genocide. And so tribalism, could be, over the long term, quite disastrous, as it was in that case. In North Africa, and to some extent extending down into the Horn of Africa, into East Africa, and into the Sahelian region of West Africa, we find Islamist tendencies. That is, groups whose primary identity was religious. They were Muslim, and a number of groups protesting or otherwise marking themselves out within the colonial system as opponents of that system. did so on the basis of Islam. They saw the West as being corrosive culturally and religiously to the Muslim world. The central driving force of these Islamist movements was Sharia law, and they expressed a desire for their society to be organized and governed on the basis of Sharia. And to some extent, these Islamist movements corresponded, were coterminous with the brotherhoods, the Islamic brotherhoods that we've discussed in earlier lectures. And one of the most important of these, certainly in the 1920s and 30s, was the Salafiyya movement, the Salafist movement, which was a very hardline, conservative, and we might say almost fundamentalist approach to Islam, though there were exceptions. The most influential thinker among the Salafiyya in this period was Jalal al-Din al-Afghani, who's pictured here on the slide. And even though al-Afghani insisted on the primacy of Sharia and criticized the Western culture, the influence of Western culture as a means of corrupting Islam, he did embrace some aspects of modernity, saw the need for kind of large-scale political organization, and certainly for the sorts of military technology that the Europeans had at their disposal. But religiously and culturally, al-Afghani was representative here in rejecting the West and insisting on very strict Sharia as the governing principle. And so from these movements, these Islamist movements, we see the seeds of nationalism, but it's kind of a, as I say here, a hybrid nationalism. It's partly simply their Islamic identity, and it's also from this that we begin to get arguments or proponents for pan-Islam, that is a unity of all Muslims against their colonial masters. So that is merged over time with nationalist ideas, which we'll talk about in more detail in the coming lectures. So part of this kind of protest identity is Muslim, part of it is national. In some cases, those are in tension with each other. These Islamist movements, in some cases, create insurgencies who continue to engage in guerrilla warfare. So we've seen that these Muslim brotherhoods were in operation in Egypt, and Libya, and Algeria, and Morocco, and places like that. They continue to do that, and in some cases even step up the insurgency after the Italians establish kind of full colonial hegemony over Libya, for instance, in the early 1930s under Mussolini. The Islamist movements become even more kind of hardened in their commitment to oppose that and engage in sabotage and guerrilla warfare and things like that. In 1928, maybe the most important outgrowth of this politically was the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is still around today, still a major political and religious force in Egypt and other places in North Africa and the Middle East. But it was formed in 1928 in Egypt as an outgrowth, really, of the Salafiyya movement. The basic tenets of the Muslim Brotherhood were a rejection of Western culture as corrosive, though to some extent an embrace of modern-style governments and military technology. So they're thinking very much along the lines of Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. But very strict in their insistence on the primacy of Sharia and other, sorts of Muslim cultural forces. Now, outside of the Muslim world, Christian churches tend to fulfill many of the same functions that these Islamist movements fulfill in North Africa. We see in the 1920s and 30s the rise of African churches, and these grow out of white European-dominated churches, but sort of are taken over by the black Africans and and the Christianity itself in some cases is altered theologically and socially to fit with the African situation and to act as a form of protest, to form identities that insist on the primacy and independence of Africans. And many of these fit under the so-called Ethiopian movement. That is not to say these came from Ethiopia. Most of them didn't. Rather, Ethiopia is the name, kind of generic name in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, and to some extent, it's also in the New Testament. Come to think of it, for Africa. That all Africans are identified as Ethiopians. This was, after all, the Greek word for black African. And so the Ethiopian churches, which really just means African churches, began to be formed in this era. So we have these kind of black African charismatic preachers at the heads of these things. They continue to adhere to some of the basic tenets of Christianity, such things as the resurrection of Jesus and in some cases the sacraments and other things that are kind of essential components of Christianity, but they fuse these with African structures and African ideas. And so these Ethiopian churches, for instance, often do not oppose polygamy and even sort of get bound up with the social structures of the communities that they emerge in. And so we find here a religious syncretism between, the Christianity that they had embraced as they encountered these Europeans and the traditional African ways of believing and practicing religion. Most of these Ethiopian churches are also highly apocalyptic. They anticipate the end of the world. They find great resonance in the book of Revelation, though these things are invariably interpreted as references to the freedom of Africa, to the overturning of colonial oppression, and to the emergence of the African people as God's chosen people. They reject many of the kind of aesthetics of the European-style Christianity. The white Jesus, for instance, is something that they jettison, and they adopt a kind of aesthetic of Jesus and the saints that is more in keeping with the African aesthetic. These people have dark skin, and in any case, this becomes a very potent kind of cultural force. Theology also tends toward kind of liberation theology, to talking about the deliverance of their people, and some of that has an apocalyptic cast to it. A couple of examples of this: the Watchtower movement, which emerged out of the Jehovah's Witnesses in the late 19th century. This is the Watchtower is the publication put out by the Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, that achieved great resonance at the beginning of the 20th century, especially in southern Africa. A Watchtower Society was formed there with these kind of charismatic, apocalyptic preachers at its head. The Watchtower movement was heavy on kind of biblical exegesis, on interpretation of the Bible, as it related to African identities. Another example, and there are several of these actually, but in South Africa, under the segregation and later apartheid regimes, one of the most potent cultural forces among the black Africans was South African Zionism, the Zion churches, especially the Zion Christian Church, or the ZCC as it's known in South Africa. Both of the pictures you see here on the slide are the ZCC groups. The star here on the top of this church is one of the symbols. You can see not very clearly, but many of them are wearing these badges. You can see it more clearly up here with these men. But they're wearing these badges, and this was they adopted uniforms, these hats and kind of the white clothes and these large clunky shoes. were sort of the uniform, the blue dress and the green cap for the women, and this allowed them to organize collectively, gave them a kind of essential identity that was African, and these Zionist churches ended up being major sources of protest against apartheid, certainly expressions of African solidarity and African commitment to African interests. There were also worker movements, and these rose especially in southern Africa, where there was a lot of industry and mining taking place, of course. And this is where we see much of the kind of early forms of political insurgency and political protest. The African National Congress, as I said in an earlier lecture, was founded in 1912, but it remained actually quite small for many years. Later on in that decade, and especially into the 1920s, the most potent force for organizing in protest against apartheid or against segregation in South Africa was actually a worker movement rather than a political movement. It was known as the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union of Africa. You can see here a kind of broadsheet or something or a poster, whatever. Of the acronym for it was the ICU, which you can see here kind of on this banner. And the ICU ended up being a mass movement involving more than 100,000 people at one point who had membership in this. It was brutally oppressed by the segregationist government, declared illegal on the basis of, on the basis of kind of developmental theory. The South African government said that unions and other worker movements were a specifically European thing, and that this was not natural to Africa, and this would somehow hurt their development as a people. This, of course, was all bunk, an effort to keep the Africans from organizing, but that was the basis on which they opposed this. But it did carry out a number of massive strikes that were a thorn in the side of the segregationist government in South Africa, and really served to kind of coalesce the protest against the growing segregation there. The issues that these people fought, and it also served as a model, a template for other worker movements that began to emerge in Africa, other parts of Africa. What were they protesting? Well, the pass laws, the requirement that all Africans carry documentation with them everywhere they went, the terrible working conditions in the mines and in the factories, the color bars that prevented Africans from getting skilled labor positions, even if they were qualified for them, that all of those positions, which of course had a higher pay grade, came or were given to whites entirely, and this was certainly the case in South Africa and even to some extent in places like Rhodesia. Also, the wage gaps between white and black workers were tremendous, and that's another thing they were protesting. Housing conditions. Initially in South Africa, in places like Johannesburg, black workers were confined to all-male hostels. Women were not allowed to come with their husbands. Families were broken up, and the housing was inadequate. In terms of clean water and sanitation and comfort in many ways. Men slept, dozens to a room. It really was a kind of terrible situation to live in, justified on the basis of these people being foreign workers as they contrived them. But all of these things served as ways of protest. And I should say that even though the ICU collapsed under pressure from the government and kind of internal discord, that the identities created by organizations like the ICU, the issues to which they drew reference, and the consciousness, the collective consciousness this created among mine workers and industrial workers in South Africa and Rhodesia, would serve the African community quite well over the years. It was, in meetings, collective meetings, that they began to form strategies that would damage the apartheid government ultimately. Things like working slowly, sabotaging equipment when they felt they could do it without being detected, striking in times when they felt they could get away with it, and so this was an important crucible for later developments of these identities. We'll see that World War II played a big role in a number of ways in helping to continue to foster these identities. That industrial output grew to great heights during that period, and labor was needed, and so in many cases these worker movements decided to take the opportunity at that point to strike, and because the labor was needed so badly, the vehicles and airplanes and ammunition and other things were needed so badly, the management and governments often were in no position to hold out against these worker movements, and often gave in to their demands. There was a major strike, for instance, in northern Rhodesia among copper miners in 1940 as the Battle of Britain was going on, and obviously Britain had interests, had concerns that they had to attend to, and this strike caught them unawares, and they eventually ended up caving into some of the demands of the mine workers. A related issue here is the continued, in fact the pace has stepped up a great deal, the continued migration of people to cities. And with the crystallizing of tribal identities, this created a new dynamic in the cities that was at times problematic and at times helpful to the African cause. For one, Europeans often tried to, if they allowed Africans to live legally in the urban environment, sometimes they tried to prevent that from happening, but once they capitulated and allowed them to live in the urban environment, they tried to keep people separate. So they initially tried to do this by having only men there. When that proved impracticable, then they tried to create these neighborhoods, townships as they're called, basically black neighborhoods that were divided by ethnicity. And so, in a township outside of Johannesburg, for instance, you might find, at least this is the way that the government tried to set it up, there would be a Xhosa neighborhood and a Zulu neighborhood and a Sotho neighborhood and a Tswana neighborhood, all with the goal of keeping these people separate from each other, with the excuse that they needed to develop each within their own tribal identities, which were, of course, new contrivances mostly. But this backfired on them as townships and other urban environments ended up becoming melting pots for people to form identities that were not tied to these tribal identities. It's in that melting pot that organizations like the African National Congress really began to have success, as we'll talk about later on. Really, for the first time in the 1920s and 30s, the white governments or the European governments in places like South Africa, Rhodesia, Kenya, began to allow for permanent black settlement, even entire families to leave the homelands, though in many cases they would create a kind of homeland section out of the black neighborhood. And so, for instance, outside of Pretoria, which was the executive capital of South Africa, there were a lot of these townships. Actually, I lived and worked for a time in one called Mabopane, but Mabopane, Mamelodi, Attridgeville, Garankuwa, and these are all kind of townships outside of Pretoria. Well, they extended the borders of one of these reserves, these native reserves, to fit in these areas that the blacks were settled in the urban environment. And so that was one of the ways they got around it. When it came to Johannesburg, for instance, that was impossible because there were no homelands near this, near enough at least. And so they created these townships. They set them up with kind of semi-permanent housing, really kind of track housing. You can see a picture here at the bottom left of the slide of the largest of these, which was called Soweto. That sounds like an African name, but it's actually an acronym for Southwest Townships. though interestingly it's been taken and that term has been taken and rendered into many of these languages as a new word, and has become a real touchstone for cultural identity in South Africa. But you can see that, these are cheaply made houses, and basically uniform in nature, usually probably 4 rooms, maybe 3-room dwellings, and entire families would fit into these. But this became the real setting. And to some extent there was ethnic conflict in the urban setting in these cases. People brought their identities with them, and sometimes their leaders, opposed interaction with people of other ethnic identities. But again, for the most part, these were melting pots, and people began to adopt urban identities. For one, the urban environment afforded people freedom from the problematic structures of traditional life, and this was especially the case for women. Women in the cities might not be able to insist on things that they couldn't in the village. For instance, a say in whom they married, or they might be able to go to work as a domestic servant or something like that and earn their own money. And so the urban environment was, I think, beneficial for the growth and development of women's identities. Though this was also very disruptive to the kind of traditional identities that people brought with them. And this is another source of conflict that people could be seen. Some groups, for instance, could be seen as corrupting the traditional identities, which again were in many cases fairly recent contrivances. The Great Depression had a profound effect on Africa, as it did most other parts of the world, for a number of reasons. Most importantly, wage stagnation, that the jobs, especially in things like mining and industrial output, completely froze, and in some cases even went backward, and more people were laid off because the demand for industrial output and metals, and especially luxury items like diamonds, lessened considerably during the Great Depression. But this did hurt whites as well as blacks. In places like Kenya, where there were these white farmers who had claimed large tracts of land, the Depression often forced their farms to go under and pushed them away from those farms, either to go back to Europe, or in places like Rhodesia in South Africa, where there were large populations of whites, or Algeria for that matter. The problems of the Depression, forced them to abandon their farms and move into the cities, where they really took up their place as working class people, unskilled laborers. And they were competing with black Africans for jobs. If they received those jobs, they would be given higher wages. In many cases, factory owners or mine companies were reluctant actually to hire these white working class people because they demanded higher wages. And so this group became a very potent political force in South Africa. In fact, it was the kind of the political posturing, political drives of these working class whites in South Africa that forced a fracturing of the National Party in South Africa in the late 1930s and early 1940s, and this fracturing would ultimately lead to the victory of what was called initially as the Purified National Party, but later just the National Party in 1948, and the permanent establishment of apartheid at that point, and kind of this granting of or declaring of independence from Britain. I mean, all of the Great Depression set all of those things into motion there. In places where there was not a lot of white presence, those parts of Africa where whites were just a kind of thin caste of people at the top of the colonial governments, the Great Depression still did hurt people tremendously, especially those who were involved in cash crop farming, because the demand for these cash crops ended up collapsing, and people were not growing enough food to to live. They were depending entirely on selling their cash crops, and this caused some serious problems socially and politically. Well, that gets us into rural life. Really, many people in rural Africa faced what we might call the poverty trap. The falling of cash crop prices, especially after the advent of the Great Depression, as a result of this, they needed to put more land under cultivation, and in many cases they chose to plant simply more cash crops in order to receive the profit that was necessary to keep them going, which meant that they took land away from the growing of food crops in order to grow more cash crops, and then they were left without food. And then the whole cycle would just sort of continue into another, revolution on the downward revolution. And so this was very, very damaging to many peasant farmers in Africa. In the rural setting, in the farming of cash crops, there were large European companies. The most prominent of these, you can see the poster here, was the United Africa Company. It was the African version of, say, Monsanto or ConAgra or Archer Daniels Midland, or one of these huge agricultural conglomerates in the United States. And these companies ended up being the ones, it wasn't the colonial government itself, but these companies ended up being the ones who administered most of the economic functions of the colonies. And so it had tremendous power. The UAC and other colonial entities would often make demands of peasant farmers that they grow a certain amount of these cash crops, that they provide labor for the large European-owned plantations. We've talked about all of these things already to some extent. And so rural protest movements began in places where these conditions reached crisis level. And so we find organizations of farmers, in some cases even things like self-help groups among farmers, trying to act in ways that are independent, trying to break away from the dominance of the UAC and these European companies. They also ended up protesting against competition from Asian peoples who had settled, especially in East Africa and places like Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania, or Tanganyika as it was known at that point. There were large neighborhoods, large communities of Asians, especially South Asians, Indian people, who had moved there and had taken up a dominant position in certain parts of the marketplace, especially the selling of luxury goods, the kind of brokering of deals like that. And so they were seen as just an extension of the oppression of the colonial apparatus, and because they were closer in proximity to the African farmers, these Asian people ended up being the targets of a lot of these protests, and even sometimes outright violence. Also, interestingly, and here's where we begin to see the fracturing of the whole colonial apparatus, these rural protest movements, in many cases, came into conflict with the indirect rule chiefs. The chiefs were frequently tasked with the unwelcome responsibility of exacting quotas and other requirements. The colonial officials didn't go in directly and try to force people to grow certain foods. They relied on the chiefs to do that. The chiefs were, of course, paid handsomely and given other privileges, sometimes even taken to Europe on junkets and things like that. And so chiefs came increasingly to be seen as puppets of the Europeans, as corrupt, and as not representing the interests of the people. And so these protest movements end up targeting chiefs for opprobrium and for protest. And over time, many of these chiefs begin to lose their clout, and begin to be really ineffective at forcing people to do anything. And this causes the colonial governments to begin to intervene directly into people's lives rather than work through the chiefs. and this creates only more resentment among Africans there. And so all of these things are being set into motion that will eventually erupt into nationalist movements and things like this. But before we get to nationalism, before we really talk about this, there are a few other kind of preliminary things, other places or points of protest. We find protest in opposition to colonialism, and also a kind of growing African identity among African artists. In their artwork, they express their discontent. We find it in newspapers, which begin to appear on the continent, published, reported, administered by African people. We also find movements that emerge in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States and the Caribbean, making their way into Africa. So, for instance, the ideas of Marcus Garvey, an African American, actually I think he was born in the Caribbean, who began to preach the idea of the unity of all African peoples, whether we're talking about people in Africa or people who are part of the African diaspora, people who whose nativity or whose ancestry is in Africa. Garvey was a tremendously influential intellectual, and he was associated to some extent with the Harlem Renaissance and other things in the United States. This was an outgrowth. Well, these ideas began to make it into Africa. They found a special resonance in French countries, which developed this notion of negritude, which was both an awareness of African identity and a celebration of it as ancient and commendable and unique from what the Europeans said. And so this contributes to this emerging consciousness and emerging protest. Negritude actually is one of the most important facets of these growing identities. These people identify themselves as black and as African, and find great pride in identifying themselves that way. But the forms that these protests take, that these kind of protest identities take, is varied, and hopefully this lecture has indicated how varied it is. We find, so for instance, among the educated elite, who would have been the chief proponents of these ideas of negritude, some ideas that diverge in many ways from the protest identities that are formulated by, for instance, the commercial and professional peoples, the leaders of organizations like the ICU and worker movements, or in some cases these kind of rural agricultural movements. And so the educated elite, many of them, begin to insist on something called Pan-Africanism. That is the unity of all African peoples, and with the purpose of opposing and ultimately driving out the European master, the European conqueror. And these intellectuals, which include, among their number, many of those who would eventually be the leaders of the independence movements. And so we find, for instance, among the chief proponents of Pan-Africanism, figures like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, or in what was then called the Gold Coast, Julius Nyerere in Tanganyika, who would later become the leader of Tanzania, Leopold Senghor in Senegal, the first president of independent Senegal. And their idea was that no individual colony could rise up and be strong enough to cast off the colonial yoke, but if multiple peoples from multiple colonies would join together under the banner of Pan-Africanism, that this would be the means of ridding themselves of the European presence and establishing independence in Africa. That's the chief kind of line of thinking of Pan-Africanism. Now, as we're going to see, things don't end up that way, that many of these proponents of Pan-Africanism ultimately settle for individual national independence. But at least at this point in the 20s and 30s, people were not thinking along those lines, largely because these colonies had such artificial boundaries that had nothing to do historically, in most cases, with the political entities in Africa itself, or with ethnic identities. And so there was an acknowledgement of that, and there was opposition to, in some cases, to this kind of just regional or local protest identity. They said it needs to be regional or Pan-African. However, among many of these movements, these various movements, we find a new generation who is incredibly active politically, and who saw both the indirect rule chiefs and even many of this kind of first generation of intellectuals as hopelessly astray, and so forming among in various movements. So, for instance, in the African National Congress in South Africa, we find a youth movement, and interestingly, many of the early leaders of this youth movement end up being the major figures who oppose apartheid. So, in the youth movement in the 1930s and 40s, well, especially the 1940s, we find Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, and others who end up being Mac Maharaj, and others who end up being the chief protesters of apartheid. Okay, hopefully all of that made some sense, and we can begin to think in productive ways about African identities taking shape, but these are not uniform. In some cases people are thinking on Pan-African lines, in other cases they're thinking on regional lines, in other cases they're thinking on local lines. Some people are organizing via their churches or their Islamic movements. Others are organizing with their fellow workers in the industrial or commercial setting. Others are organizing political parties with various goals and various identities. And so, these identities are really quite fluid and varied, and it's not until really after World War II that they begin to crystallize into effective organizations that oppose continued colonialism in more effective ways.